Okay, good morning. We are on Yud Amud Beis, all the way on the bottom of the Amud, or 10b4. Okay, so the Mishnah. Let's explain. So the Mishnah, we're at the second column on 10b4, or the bottom of Yud Amud Beis. The Mishnah said, "Im yesh lo tzuras haPesach, afal pi sheracha me'eser eino tzorach l'mayit." So if the entrance is wider than 10 amos, okay. So basically this, right? We're talking every place that we're talking about, we have any enclosed area by definition is going to have some hole in it, right? Something that allows a person to enter and exit, right? By definition, or else you can't actually function with it, right? So obviously it's going to have an entrance. The question is, at what point, at some point, it's no longer going to be considered an entrance. It's considered no longer a structure because there are too many holes in it, right? In other words, imagine this room. Imagine if 3.5 of the walls were knocked down. What would you call it? An empty space, right? Whereas right now you have 4 walls and you have a small door, right? So you say, oh, it's an enclosed area, right? So there's going to be always a tension between the breaches or the holes in the wall, as opposed to, and how do we find this? Do we find this as like a hole and therefore losing its status as an enclosed area, or do we find it as an entranceway? So the Mishnah told us that if there's 10 amos of width within any of the walls, let's say in the front, then it's going to invalidate it from being an enclosed area. It's simply too wide. There's no way of enclosing it. That's what the Mishnah initially told us. However, the Mishnah said if it has a tzuras haPesach. What is a tzuras haPesach? So until now, we've been talking about these different ways of enclosing a structure. One of them was the lechi, the side beam. One of them was the cross beam, the korah. And now a tzuras haPesach is when you have like a full-fledged doorway, right? 2 posts and a top, right? Which obviously is much more enclosing, right? Much more enclosing as opposed to like a thing on the side, a thing on the top. This is like, oh, this looks like an actual doorway because it is a doorway. That's literally what it is. So the Mishnah says, if it has a tzuras haPesach, even if it's wider than 10 amos, then we still see it as enclosed. Right? So even though it's a significant breach, but if it has that structure, it's going to be considered closed. Okay? So the Gemara says, and if you recall, we also had all the way back in the beginning, we spoke about a machlokas about when it's too high, when the korah is too high. Let's say it's more than 20 amos high. We saw the Rabbanan say that's too high, it's invalid. But then we said if it has like something that kind of sticks out, like some like unique design up above, then even though it's higher, it's still going to be okay. That's what those 2 halachos that we've spoken about. So 10 amos is too wide, 20 amos is too high. However, there are different things that allow you to go even beyond that. One of them is if it's too wide, if it's a tzuras haPesach, then you're able to go even wider. And if it's too high, if it has a nice funky design, whatever, something which sticks out, something which is prominent, that's the translation, then even if it's higher than 20 amos. That's what we've seen. And now what the Gemara is going to question is, what about if it's the opposite? What if it's more than 10 amos wide, but it has something when the korah is very prominent? Or what if it's higher than 20 amos, but it has a tzuras haPesach? Right? So we're flipping do these adjustments work in the opposite cases? Right? So we said 10 amos, tzuras haPesach, more than 10 amos, tzuras haPesach works. What if it's higher than 20 amos? Does tzuras haPesach work? And we said if it's higher than 20 amos, then the prominence works. What if you put what if it's wider than 10 amos, does a prominence work? Right? So we're just flipping do these allowances, these adjustments work on the opposite case? That's what the Gemara is going to ask. So Ashkechan, tzuras haPesach to mahanya barachbo. We find a tzuras haPesach, the door frame, working even if it's wider than 10 amos. V'maltera de mahanya begavo, and we find the prominence effective even if it's more than 20 amos. Ipchamai, what about the opposite? We're in Yud Aleph, Amud Aleph. So Tashma, the Gemara tries to answer it from the following brisa. The Tanya, Mavoi shehu gavoa me'esrim ama yemait. If a mavoi, meaning the korah, the top beam, is higher than 20 amos, then you have to decrease the height. Vim yeshlo tzuras haPesach, if it has a tzuras haPesach, okay, eino tzorach l'mayit, then you don't have to decrease it. Okay, so you see very clearly that a tzuras haPesach works even when it's higher than 20 amos, right? That's what the brisa is saying explicitly. That if it's higher, again, it says if it's higher than 20 amos, you have to lower it. But if you have a tzuras haPesach, you have a door frame, then you do not need to lower it. So we see clearly that a tzuras haPesach works not only when it's wider than 10 amos, but it also works when it's higher than 20 amos. Okay, but what it doesn't address is amaltera barach bomai. What about the prominence for its width, right? That only answers one of the questions. It answers the question that when it's higher than 20 amos, then a door frame, then a tzuras haPesach works, even though it's higher than 20 amos. But what about when it's wider than 10 amos? Does a korah that is prominent, does that work? That the brisa has not addressed. So Mara tries to bring a proof from the following. Tashma was taught in the Brisa. Tashma, let's come and learn. Tanya was taught in the Brisa. Mavoi shugavoam esrim ama yemait. If a mavoi is higher than 20 amos, you have to decrease the height. V'aracha me'eser amos. And if it's wider than 10 amos, you have to decrease the width. Okay, so far so good. Then it says, Vim yesh lo tzurach apesach, eino tzurach lemait. If the entranceway has a tzuras apesach, then you don't have to decrease it. Okay, if the entranceway has a tzuras apesach, you don't have to decrease it. Vim yesh lo masara, eino tzurach lemait. And if the mavoi has a prominence, you don't have to decrease it. Okay, so this brisa is a little bit vague, right? But this brisa gave both the cases which are invalid, wider than 10, invalid, higher than 20, invalid. And then it said, but if you have a tzuras pesach, the door frame, you don't have to make it smaller. And if you have the prominence, you don't have to make it smaller. So it says the Gemara tries to infer from here. My lav asefa, when it spoke about the prominent korah, right? Isn't that going on the second case as well? Meaning, in the case where it's wider than 10 amos, and it's saying that the prominence works. The Gemara says, lo aresha. Who says? Maybe it's just going on the first case where it's higher than 20 amos. In other words, right? So in other words, again, the Gemara's question is as follows. All we know so far explicitly is that a malsera, the prominence, when a korah is higher than 20 amos, it's going to work even though it's higher than 20 amos. The question is, if it's wider than 10 amos, does a prominent korah, is that enough of like a recognition that even though it's too wide, it would still serve as like a reminder, and therefore even though it's wider than 10 amos, it would still work. So the Gemara quotes a brisa where it talks about both invalidations and both corrections. It says, a mavoi which is too high, you have to make lower. A mavoi which is too wide, you have to make more narrow. And then it gives both like corrections. It says, if you put a tzuras pesach, if you have a door frame, then it's okay. And if you make a prominence, it's okay. Now the Gemara assumed that both corrections are going on both invalidations. That both the making a tzuras pesach works, making a door frame works for the 20 amos too high or 10 amos too wide, and the prominence works when it's 20 amos too high and 10 amos wide. The Gemara says no, and it's not clear from there. Maybe the prominence only works on one of those invalidations, it doesn't work on the other. In other words, this brisa is not clearly, addressing our question because it doesn't say explicitly that if it's too wide, the prominent korah will work. It's just not clear enough, and therefore we have no proof. Okay? So now, so far we've been assuming, based on our Mishnah, that everyone agrees that a tzuras pesach, a door frame, will work when something is wider than 10 amos. However, as we'll see, it doesn't. Not everyone agrees to this. Masni lo Rav Yehuda, we're at the second column, 11a1. Masni le Rav Yehuda lechia barav kamei de Rav. Okay, so Rav Yehuda was teaching this Mishnah to chia barav in the presence of Rav, and he said, "Eino tzarach lamayit." If the mavoi entrance is wider than 10 amos, but it has a door frame, you do not need to decrease its width. And Rav speaks up. He says, "Amarle asniye tzarach lamayit." He says, "No, the Mishnah should say that you do need to decrease it. That even if it has a door frame, even if it has a tzuras pesach, and if it's wider than 10 amos, it is not good, and you'd have to narrow it, okay? This is a huge, this has tremendous ramifications, because whenever we're talking about, public spaces, very often you're going to have places, streets that are larger than 10 amos. So if you have some form of a door frame over that street, you have some form of a structure over the street, you're going to be fine. According to the Mishnah, however, Rav says, no, we don't possibly like that. Rav says that the Mishnah the version of the Mishnah we have in front of us is corrupt, and really it's saying that even if there is a tzuras pesach, even if there is a door frame, you'd have to, if it's wider than 10 amos, it would never be valid. Okay, so says Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef now wants to infer something from Rav. Amar Rav Yosef mi divrei Rabbeinu nilmad. Rav Yosef says, from the words of Rav, that a tzuras pesach is not valid for an opening wider than 10 amos, we can make the following deduction. Chatzar sheruba psachim mechalonos. Let's say you have a courtyard that is made up of windows and entranceways. Okay, so imagine you have a courtyard that instead of being like fenced in, with actual walls all around it, instead you have big, large windows, and then you have entranceways, right? But it's a structure. It's like a four-walled structure. But throughout, it has windows, it has doors, it has windows, it has doors. So the sum total is that you're going to have more. You're going to have more open than closed, right? We spoke about this before. More open than closed, but it has windows and it has doors, which means it has a tzuras pesach. It has these door frames throughout, because the window is a door frame, right? The window is going to be one of these old school windows, which is going to go all the way down like a, what are those, the window like top to bottom. There's a term for that? I don't know. Top to bottom window. You know what I mean? It goes window all the way. Yeah. whatever, not like a window, like a window like that. Basically, like a window that goes from the floor up. So basically, it has a tzuras haPesach, right? And it's going to be like, right. So it has a structure. If you turn the, look at the bottom over here, right? You see those. It has, okay, even if it's not all the way, fine. The bottom line is it go all the way. If you look at 11A1, there's a picture over here of you have doorways, you have windows, but the bottom line is you calculate everything. There's more open than closed. Right? So you have a case, a chatzar sheruba psachim mechalonos. It's a chatzar, a courtyard, which is made up of entranceways and windows. Okay, so all the openings are greater than all the wall segments. In other words, there's more open than closed. Okay? Einani teres b'tzuras haPesach. We can learn from Rav that it is not going to be permitted through a tzuras haPesach. That even though over here, each of these things have like a frame around it, it would not be valid. It would not close them off. My timer, where do you get this from? She says like this. Since an opening wider than 10 amos is forbidden in a mavoy, meaning even, okay, since in general, an opening wider than 10 amos, is going to invalidate a mavoy, right? That's what we've been saying until now. If it's larger than 10 amos, forget it's Tzuras haPesach now. Everyone agrees that if it's wider than 10 amos, it invalidates an enclosed area. Uparutz maruba ala omeid oser bechatzer. And a gap, whenever you have more gap than closed, than wall segments, then it prohibits carrying in an enclosed area. Okay? So far those are two invalidations. There's one invalidation called a gap wider than 10 amos. There's another invalidation of a space where even if the gaps are smaller than 10 amos, but if all the open areas in general are more than the closed area, we spoke about this yesterday, then it's also an invalidation. Okay? So ma yoser me'eser ha'oser b'mavoy eino nitzer b'tzuras haPesach. Just like when something is wider than 10 amos, which invalidates the mavoi, then correcting it with a door frame is not a good correction. It doesn't actually help, according to Rav. So too, this other type of opening, which is when you have more open than closed, cannot be corrected by making a door frame. So let's just understand what's going on here. In other words, this goes back to how we started today. Whenever you have, we're trying to, this whole idea of a opening which is wider than 10 amos is a question of at what point is a door no longer a door? Right? In other words, that's really the question. The question is, even though it's enclosed, but at some point it's too wide, and therefore they say, no. You no longer have an enclosure over here. It's broken. It's broken. What do you mean? It's so nice. It's framed. Doesn't matter. The bottom line is it's just too wide, and therefore we no longer see it as enclosed. Okay? Similarly, it's the same principle that's going on when we speak about the concept of omei, when it's more gaps than closed. We'll say, what do you mean? Granted, that there's more open space than closed space, but they're all framed, they all look perfect. Like, why would you say it's enough? But the bottom line is, if it's too open, it's no longer enclosed, right? It's the same concept in both, and therefore it's saying, since it's the same concept in both, just like Rav says that a tzuras haPesach, a door frame, does not work when it's wider than 10 amos, because even though you'll say, what do you mean? It's so nicely framed. It should be closed. We say, no, it's just too much, too open, right? And therefore it's invalid. So Rav Yosef is trying to say the same principle will apply when you have more gaps than closed. Even though they're all nicely framed, it's just too open. And therefore Rav, who said it's invalid by wider than 10 amos, is also going to invalidate over here. That's the Gemara's assumption. Okay? Make sense?
The windows are basically holes.
Because they're holes, right? And the question is, again, when is an opening not an opening, right? When is opening not an opening, and when is it just considered a hole, right? That's the tension over here, right? So it says, good. So it says the Gemara 11a2. So the Gemara says, no. Maybe there's no comparison. Mali yotzer me'eser oser b'mavoi. Maybe you can't make this comparison because when it's wider than 10 amos, which again prohibits carrying in a mavoi, shekain lo hitarta bo etzel passe birios l'rimeir. When it's right. So when it's wider than 10 amos, we know that Rab Meir says when you have openings wider than 10 amos, we know Rab Meir in the case of passe birios, right? Passe birios again is that case of the well where the rabbis wanted to ensure that people don't have something to drink. So we said that you have these L-shaped things in each corner and have the well over here. Rabbi Meir said that the limit to how far they could be from one another is no more than 10 amos. Okay? So Rabbi Meir, in the case of a larger than 10 amos, he says it cannot be done. So, however, Tomer beparetz meruba la'omeid osur bechatzer sheken hitarta etzel paste birios l'divrei hakol. However, even Rabbi Meir agrees in the case of paste birios. In that case, the L-shaped corners, is there more closed or more open in the case where there's L-shaped corners? more open, right? The whole case of the L-shaped thing is, again, you have this is your outdoor. You have a well over here. My Gemara is this whole thing is the desert or whatever, the street. You have a well over here, and the rabbis come along and they say, okay, put a little one am over here, one am like a little tiny corner over here, tiny corner over here. Everyone's going to agree that that's good. Now that's a case where, by definition, clearly there's more open space than closed space in closing this thing, and yet it's valid. And yet, in that same case, according to a mayor, the gaps cannot be more than 10 amos. So what do you see from there? You see from there that having open more than closed is more lenient than having gaps of 10 amos. Because at least we have one opinion who says that you could have an enclosure which is very minimally closed in, just the corners, and yet it's a good enclosure, and yet that same opinion says if it's more than 10 amos, it's not going to be valid. So what you see from there is that don't tell me that they're identical. The whole premise of the inference that Rav Yosef tried making was saying that just like by wider than 10 amos, Tzuras Pesach doesn't work, so too when there's more open than closed. What do you mean so too? One is more stringent than the other, because we see from the case of Pasi Birios, the corners, there you have more open than closed, right? And everyone says it's fine. And yet, there's a limitation, at least according to one opinion, says you can't be more than 10 amos. So you see, the more than 10 amos thing is more stringent. So maybe only by the more than 10 amos idea does Rebbe say that there a Tzuras Pesach does not work. But maybe when it's just because it's more open than closed, like the case of the many windows and doors, maybe there he would say that a door frame works, because we're seeing from the case of Pasi Birios that that more open than closed is less stringent than the width of 10 amos. Make sense? Okay. So Gemara says, you're right, there's no proof. Now the Gemara tries to bring a proof from somewhere else. Let's try to bring a proof from the following. Defanos halalu sherubim psachim v'chalonos mutter. Okay, you have a case where walls that enclose an area which are mostly entrances and windows is permitted. Okay, so there are walls that enclose an area, mostly entrances and windows, or it's permitted to carry inside there. Uvilvad she'omein meruba laparutz, as long as the wall segments exceed the gaps. Now, this brisa doesn't make sense, because on the one hand it said that there are mostly doors and mostly windows, meaning it's mostly open, and then it says you're allowed to carry in it if it's mostly closed. Which one is it? Is it mostly open? Or is it mostly closed? So Gemara says Sheruba and Tzolka Daitak, which are mostly open, mostly open. How do you read this? So Ella Ema Sheriba Behem Psachim Echalonos. So what the way to read the brisa is saying like this. The brisa is saying that you're allowed to carry in this place, okay, when you're allowed to carry in a place where you made entrances and windows, meaning you made frames, as long as there is more closed than open. So the way we're reading the brisa now is saying that even though there are door frames and door frames and window frames throughout, it is only valid if it is more closed than open, which does seem to say very clearly, right? The way we're reading it now is that even when that if it has more openings than closed, it would not be valid, right? Even if there are door frames, right? Again, the way we're reading the brisa right now is to say that you're only allowed to carry in this structure, in this courtyard, which has mostly windows and doors, only if there is more closed than open, even though it has door frames. But if it would be more open than closed with door frames, you would not be allowed to carry. Okay, so the Gemara says, no, Amrav Kahana, Kitanya hi, bepischei shimai. It's only when the doorways, the entranceways that are being discussed over here are defective ones. That, everyone's going to agree, is not going to be valid. My pischei shemai, what are defective entranceways? Pligi ba Rav Rechume Rav Yosef. Rav Rechume and Rav Yosef argue. Chad Amar Deleslei Shikvei. One says it has no side posts. In other words, it has not straight side posts. Rather, if you look at the picture on the bottom of 11A2, it's like one brick yes, one brick no, one brick yes, one brick no. In other words, it's not a proper side post. V'chad Amar Deleslu Tikra. One says that it's an entranceway that has no tops. The bottom line is that this brisa, which says that the only way this courtyard is going to be valid is if you have more closed than open, even though it has entranceways, even though it has door frames, it's talking about lousy door frames, and that's why you need to have more closed than open. But maybe if it was proper door frames, you would be allowed to have more open than closed. Okay, let's go a little bit further. Rav Yochanan Savar Lahad Rav. Rav Yochanan agrees to the opinion of Rav that a Tzuras Pesach wider than 10 amos is invalid. Right? Again, Rav was the one who came along that even though the version of our Mishnah says that if you have a Tzuras HaPesach, if you have a door frame, when it's wider than 10 amos, it's going to be valid. Rav said, no, it's not valid. Okay, he said our Mishnah is corrupt, and Rav Yochanan agrees, as we're about to see. Ravin bar Rav Adam, Rav Yitzchak, Maisa ba'adam echan bikas beis chorsan. Yeah, there was a certain person who lived in the valley of Beis Chorsan. Shenat arba kundesin ba'arba pinos asada. He had a field, okay, and he stuck 4 poles in the corners of his field, umasach zemora aleim, and he stretched a vine from pole to pole. Okay, he created essentially a tzuras haPesach. Tzuras haPesach is posts and a top. So what this guy did, he had a field. And we'll see in this field, he wants to go ahead. The field, there's 2 potential issues in this field. One is a question of kilayim. Kilayim is that, again, we spoke about you can't plant like vines, you can't plant like grapes and vines next to wheat. Okay, you can't plant it next to other substances. That is kilayim. That is a form of what we call shanes. In other words, a form of mixing. However, if there's a wall, you're allowed to plant one thing in one thing in the other. Not only if there's a full-fledged brick wall, but even if you have a halachic wall, it's also going to be okay. Okay? So this guy basically wants to create a halachic wall. He doesn't want to build like a whole brick wall. He's like the first of the 3 little pigs, right? So basically he goes ahead and he puts a corner here, and he takes the vine and he wraps it around. And so now we have a tzuras haPesach all around the entire thing because there's posts and there is vine and there's top, right? So he comes in front of the rabbis, okay? Uva ma'isa lifnei chachamim, and he comes in front of the sages for them to rule. V'yitir lo in klayim, and they permitted it regarding klayim. In other words, they said you could grow vines on one side of the partition and something else on the other side, even though there's nothing blocking it. But halachically, we see it as 2 distinct areas. There'd be no prohibition of kilayim. Okay? And Reish Lakish comes along and he weighs and he says, just like they permitted the person to rely on this partition regarding kilayim, they also permitted him to carry in the space because there's a tzuras haPesach. Now, okay, there's a tzuras haPesach, okay? And Rabbi Yochanan Amar, le'inyan Shabbos lo yitir lo. Rabbi Yochanan came along and said, no, they only permitted it for kilayim, but they did not permit him to carry in the space regarding Shabbos. Now, we don't know from this case how wide are these walls, are these spaces. Doesn't say, right? But the Gemara is going to make an inference. The Gemara says like this: B'ma'askin, what are we dealing with? Ilema min hatzad. If you want to say that the vines were set up in a way where you have the poles, and then instead of going on top of the poles, it's next to the poles. Okay, right? It's not on top of the poles; it's next to the poles, right? Which is the easier way to do it. Let's say if I have, a 2 poles and I want to attach strings to it, so I can attach the string like from the side of the pole. I'm not going to go on top. On top of the pole is the hardest place to attach it. I'll attach it to the side of the pole and then I'll pull it over, as opposed to making it go on top of the pole, right? So if you say it's from the side, it accomplishes nothing. By the way, this is one of the hard parts of making an Eruv. A lot of people mess up on. They're like, okay, we'll just tie the strings, but depends on what you're trying to do. Sometimes you have to make the string go on top of the pole. So right, you have to do it on top of the pole, and a lot of people do their like DIY Eruvs. People always people camping is very popular these days. So or glamping, whatever. But basically, what people do is they want to make their own Eruvs, and they're throwing around strings and this and that. But one of the things again, which is hard, you have to make like a pole. Typically, there's like a hole on the top, and then strings on the top. Whatever. It's not so simple, but basically make a tzuras haPesach on the side, it's invalid. You did nothing, right? You have to make it on top. The string has to go on top of the pole. So that can't be the case. Ela al gaban, it must be on top. Uvamai. And what are we talking about? Sorry. If you made a tzuras haPesach, where it's not on top but it's on the side, it's meaningless. Ela al gaban, rather you want to say it's on top. Uvamai. So what size are we talking about? Ilema be'eser, if you want to say that the opening was 10 amos or less, why would Rav Yochanan disagree with Reish Lakish and say, on Shabbos it's not going to be valid? Who in the world, right? Who says that a opening less than 10 amos is invalid? Why would Rav Yochanan say it's going to be invalid? It must be, we're talking about a case where the gap between the posts is more than 10 amos, and Rav Yochanan is saying what? It's not good. So what comes out of it here is Rav Yochanan is telling us, like Rav is telling us, that when you have a tzuras haPesach that is wider than 10 amos, it's going to be invalid. It's going to be invalid even though you have a tzuras haPesach. Right? So this would seem to be a proof too. This would seem to prove that Rav Yochanan agrees to Rav that when you have to Rabbi, but that when you have a tzuras haPesach that's wider than 10 amos, it's going to be invalid, at least according to Rav Yochanan. The Gemara says no, there's no proof. Lo olam be'eser. Really, we're talking about an opening of 10 amos or less. Umin hatzad, and we're talking about a case where the vine extends from the sides of the poles. Rav Chisda kamiflagi, and they're arguing about Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says that when it's from the side, when it's not directly on top, it is invalid. Okay, and Rav Yochanan would agree to that view, and Reish Lakish says even when it's from the side, it's going to be valid. So that's what their argument over here. In other words, again, that story that came in front of the sages about this guy with the vineyard, he set it up where the strings were not on top of the poles. Reish Lakish says it's fine, even though it's not on top. Rav Yochanan said it's invalid, and that's what they were talking about, but they were not talking about a case where it's wider than 10 amos with the Teres Pesach. There we don't know Rav Yochanan would say on that. Okay, we'll pick up tomorrow. Have a great day.